So I'm not here as an advocate for qualitative research. I'm not here to damage the whole endeavour of randomised controlled trials. I'm here to say, let's just think about all the research questions that we have to address and the value that we place on those. And really, when I think about value, I'm not just thinking about the fact that qualitative research can make a contribution or can be interesting and offer us some interesting information. What I'm doing is thinking about, well, what's its worth? You know, why are we doing this? And can we get best value for money for the effort that we put into using qualitative research? I personally feel that there is a large differential between the value that we place on different questions. And this very large weighted person at the end of the seesaw here is the randomised controlled trial. And what I'm doing is thinking about the other research questions that we need to address and thinking about getting more of a balance in terms of the value we place on these research questions and therefore the methods that we use to address each of these research questions. Qualitative research is excellent at addressing processes, and we can use both qualitative and quantitative research to address processes. And if we look at the recent guidance on undertaking process evaluations of complex interventions, recently issued by the UK Medical Research Council, it advocates the use of both qualitative and quantitative research, and it identifies three functions. Mechanisms of action or impact, that is, how is an intervention actually working? Implementation, what are the processes that are needed to help it to work or that stop it working? And then finally, the context in which it operates. How does the context affect the processes and affect the outcomes? So what I want to do is look at some of the value that we can get from using qualitative research. I did talk about 8 rationales. What I've done is squash them into about 5 just to make the talk a little bit zippier. And I will actually cover most of those rationales today, but not all of them. I'm using sort of rationales and value. I think we can have a rationale, but you need something more in order to get the value of that rationale. And I'll talk that through as we go through the slides. So one of the most common things people say is, I'm going to use qualitative research, it's going to help me to explain the randomised controlled trial findings. That's great. So you can have 3 scenarios, and one scenario is that you've spent all this time and money evaluating an intervention in a randomised controlled trial, and goodness me, it's not effective. And no matter how much we think it's valuable to have this information that actually something is not effective, I think we do sometimes feel as researchers that we've failed. Oh gosh, that was a bit of a waste of time. It is not a waste of time, but it's how it feels. And because of that, I think the question, why was it not effective, increases in value. And it can be, qualitative research can be enormously valuable in this situation. I want to give an example of a randomised controlled trial I ran quite a few years ago now, probably about 15 years ago. The intervention was leaflets that summarised research evidence for women to help them make decisions in their maternity care. So for example, this leaflet here says, what position should I adopt in labour and when I give birth? And there were 10 leaflets around 10 decision points. And we ran a randomised controlled trial. It was a cluster randomised controlled trial in 10 large maternity units. 5 of the maternity units got the leaflets, 5 of them didn't. And we undertook surveys of thousands of women in each of those maternity units. And the result of that randomised controlled trial was that the leaflets did not have an effect. And the effect that they wanted to have was to increase the proportion of women who perceived that they had made informed choice in their maternity care. Luckily, alongside that randomised controlled trial, we had undertaken a large ethnographic study led by Helen Stapleton. She used observation of consultations between women, midwives and obstetricians and interviewed those three stakeholders about decision making within their care. And what she found was that although the health professionals felt that informed choice was in operation in their maternity units, Helen did not witness informed choice. She witnessed informed compliance. That health professionals gave women the information they needed to make the decisions the health professionals wanted them to make, and in fact needed them to make to fit in with the systems that were in operation in the maternity units and to be safe. So it was fantastic that that was there, and that explained the result of the trial. The leaflets didn't work, they were not effective, because informed choice, the very thing they were trying to impact on, was not operating. But what was the value of that information? Well, sometimes when I talked about the results and disseminated the results of the trial, people said, it's because they were leaflets. Very old-fashioned technology. And at the time, as I said, it was 15 years ago, people said, you really need to get those onto a CD-ROM. They'll be much more effective. Lots of people might think, what on earth is that? Today, we might be saying, oh, let's create a mobile phone app with the information. But actually, the ethnographic study, the qualitative research, was saying it's not to do with the formatting of this information. It's to do with the culture of maternity care. And so actually these leaflets may work where the culture of maternity care is different. So for example, they were evaluated in the United Kingdom. They may actually be effective in America where the culture of maternity care is different. In the UK, there is no point in trying to develop a different format. What we have to do is develop interventions that impact on the culture of maternity care in this country. So what it did was direct people away from a whole tranche of interventions that were just not going to work and move them towards a tranche of interventions that might actually have the potential to work. The last randomised control trial I was involved in, I ran the qualitative research along a randomised control trial of telehealth for improving depression and telehealth for improving risk factors for people with cardiovascular disease. So trying to reduce weight, reduce smoking, reduce blood pressure. And here the randomised control trial was partly effective. So for the depression, the effect size was reasonable, just not as large as people would have liked. For the cardiovascular disease risk factors, it affected some of the risk factors, but not all of them. So for example, it helped people to lose weight, it reduced blood pressure, but it did not help anyone to stop smoking. So it was partly effective. So here, the value of the qualitative research, probably not as high because we have partial success of the randomised control trial. But still, I would argue the qualitative research was extremely valuable because what it did was identify why the randomised control trial the interventions were partly effective. And what it identified was that continuity of delivery of the intervention by a health information advisor was an extremely important part of the intervention. It was actually a component of the intervention. The intervention developers realized it was an important component when it was developed, when the intervention was developed. But when the intervention was delivered, there was the people who are delivering the intervention couldn't deliver continuity of that advisor in the way that they wanted continuously throughout the randomized control trial. For part of the trial, there was damage done to the continuity, and because of that, the intervention was not implemented in the way that had been planned. And so the conclusion of the qualitative research was that had continuity been delivered continuously as planned, then we might have had a larger effect size. And so instead of being disappointed with the intervention, we might actually think, there's a way of fixing that problem, and we won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We'll stick with that intervention. We think it's got something about it, and we'll take it on for further research to try and improve that intervention so that the effect size could improve. So what I think I've shown there with those two examples is that the qualitative research can actually save us time, money, and effort when we're generating evidence of effectiveness. It can offer us implications for a whole body of interventions, not simply the single intervention that we're looking at. It can help us not to discard some potentially good interventions, but to think about what is working and what is not, what is fixable and what is not. It can also save us a lot of time, money and effort if we do a lot of that work before we get to the stage of the randomized control trial. So that when we're developing an intervention, we spend time thinking about the intervention, optimizing it, thinking about the feasibility and acceptability of that intervention prior to spending £1 or £2 million, dollars or euros on a randomized control trial. And at the moment, one of the, in the United Kingdom for sure, one of the most popular things to do is to ensure that the intervention is theory-based. For many years, we have used evidence-based interventions, but I think something that's becoming more and more important now is the use of person-based interventions. So Lucy Yardley, a psychologist, has sort of introduced this term. And this is where the person who's going to use the intervention and deliver the intervention are at the heart of saying what they want from an intervention and how that intervention is working in its early stages. So that the intervention that you develop in the first place has high relevance to patients and to health professionals and is useful and usable by those people before you go to expensive randomized control trial. Here's a picture of a recruitment graph for a pilot randomized control trial that I'm currently working with. This is, we've developed an intervention to help people, adults with cystic fibrosis, take their drugs, which they take through a nebulizer. They tend not to take the drugs because there's a high treatment burden. They have to spend a long time doing it. They have to take them many times in a day. And this can, if they don't take their drugs, their health gets worse. They go into hospital. They spend a lot of time in hospital. It eventually affects their long-term health and they die. And this is the recruitment graph. And the blue line here is what we are aiming to recruit, the numbers of people we're aiming to recruit over time. And the green line is the numbers we actually managed to recruit. And this is a fantastically successful recruitment graph. But I have been part of the trial where the green line just moved along the lower axis for months before it started to creep up towards the blue line. And in that trial, the trialists were doing everything that they could to try and understand what the problems were with recruitment. And they eventually got recruitment up so that it met the blue line and eventually started to move along the blue line. But what happens if your recruitment graph, the green line, continues to drag and drag and drag within your pilot trial? Do you just say, we can't recruit for this kind of trial. Let's give up. We can't do the full trial. Well, qualitative research can be used to address a problem like that. This is a picture of Jenny Donovan. She's a professor in the University of Bristol here in the United Kingdom. And she has developed an intervention which is called Quintet, which uses qualitative research to look at the recruitment practices within a trial. It can be used in a pilot feasibility trial, so that by the time you get to your full trial, you have optimized your recruitment practices. Or it can be used in a full trial when you found that the recruitment's going very, very badly. You've done everything you can and you just don't know what's happening. Jenny has constructed an intervention which uses observation of the recruitment practices and interviews with patients who are being recruited and interviews with the health professionals who are trying to recruit. And she has shown that some recruitment problems are hidden, invisible to those who are trying to recruit and to the patients themselves. So that although you can identify some problems by talking to people, you can identify rather more by listening to the recruitment process. So for example, a health professional might be convinced that they are in equipoise. They might talk in an interview about how they are in equipoise and how important that equipoise is to them and to the trial, and yet a recording of their recruitment practice will show that they're not in equipoise. And therefore you can discuss equipoise with them and they can change their recruitment practices. And she's been very, very successful down in Bristol and has attempted to use this process in trials outside Bristol as well. Sorry, let me just get back to this. We undertake randomised control trials because we want to have a message to give to people who are out there offering routine care, offering care in the real world. We want them to take the evidence from our randomised control trials and be able to use that evidence in the real world. But the context in which healthcare takes place is complex. And the context in which they are delivering that healthcare can be very different from the context in which the intervention was delivered in a randomised control trial. And it's really important to understand the complexity of the real world, the context in which the intervention might operate in that complexity, and how that is related to the context in which the intervention operates in the trial. And qualitative research can help us to understand that complexity and can help us to understand the context so that people who are offering care in a different context can think, how relevant is this finding to my context? Can I transfer this knowledge to my context, or does it have little or no relevance to my context? It also brings in the voice of what I call ordinary human beings. As researchers, we are ordinary human beings. We are patients, and some of us are health professionals. But actually, we have a different knowledge base and understanding of research from, and understanding of interventions, I think, from the wide diversity of health professionals and patients out in the real world. And qualitative research can bring in the voice of a diversity of patients and a diversity of health professionals. And this can help us to engage with the complexity and help us to understand more about context. I wanted to draw attention to the normalization process theory that was developed by Carl May and colleagues here in the UK, which actually starts with helping us to think about implementing an intervention in the real world and what we need to know, and to start thinking about that as we are developing an intervention, and as we are undertaking a feasibility study of an intervention, and as we are undertaking the randomised controlled trial of the intervention, so that the end point, the implementation of that intervention in the real world is in our heads, and we're thinking about that all the way from the very first moment. And we can understand how to make an intervention normal in routine practice at the beginning of our research by using qualitative research to understand the problems facing health professionals and patients, but mainly health professionals here for the normalization process theory. So that shapes our intervention development and our research. We often, in a randomized controlled trial, we measure a primary outcome. We have a primary outcome measure, and we rely on the validity of that outcome measure. But how confident are we about that outcome measure? Morag Farquharson down in Cambridge in the United Kingdom did a feasibility study around a pilot randomized controlled trial where she interviewed patients in a palliative care situation. And they used a validated, and I'm here, only the people in the room here with me can see me use these inverted commas up in the air. It was a validated outcome measure. But there were some concerns about its use in people making use of palliative care. So she interviewed people and she listened to them as they completed this outcome measure. And by the end of the qualitative interviews, her concerns were so great about people's understanding of the questions, the items within that outcome measure, that they decided not to use that outcome measure in the randomized controlled trial. So they increased the internal validity of their randomized controlled trial by undertaking qualitative research at that pre-trial stage. Qualitative research has also been used to understand how to widen the diversity of people who participate in randomized controlled trials. One of the biggest criticisms of randomized controlled trials is that they lack external validity. That people out there in the real world trying to use the evidence say, but I don't have patients like that, or the patients that I'm actually trying to treat, or the population group I'm looking at, include such a wide variety of people that are not represented within this randomized controlled trial. And qualitative research has been used to understand why some groups of people do not participate in randomized controlled trials that we would like to see within those randomized controlled trials, so that we can have diversity, and therefore the result of the randomized controlled trial can be more relevant to the real world. I've based everything that I've said today on reading other people's work, but also reading with my colleagues here 296 publications that were based on qualitative research undertaken with randomized controlled trials. And these publications were undertaken all over the world, Australia, Europe, Ireland, the UK, America, and some African countries. And we also interviewed 18 researchers in the United Kingdom, people who had led the qualitative research alongside trials or before trials, people also who had led the randomized controlled trials, and sometimes the people who had led both the qualitative research and the randomized controlled trials. Sometimes these people are the same. And we did this work because we were aware that qualitative research could have enormous value, but we wondered whether it was maximizing the value it could have. And we identified from the 296 papers that we read these values that I have actually talked about today. And this is just a table from the report that I've summarized here. The reason why I've put this table up is I just want to draw your attention to the word potential. Because when we read these 296 papers, we had to glean the value of the work, the qualitative research, because so much of the time the qualitative researchers did not explicitly explain the value of their work and the implications of their qualitative research for the specific trial it had been undertaken with, but also for the whole body of interventions and future trials that might be undertaken in the by other researchers. And so our plea was that, first of all, we have to articulate that value within the papers that we write so that other people can learn about the value and build on that value and make use of that value. But from interviewing our researchers, we also understood that it wasn't simply about showing the value and publishing the value, that actually how we do our research affects the contribution that qualitative research can make and the value that we can get from the qualitative research. Sometimes it felt like the randomized controlled trial was the piece of research, and it was a train, a fast-moving train, and nothing was going to stop it. So I told you about Morag Farquharson. She stopped the train. She said, hold on a minute, you can't go forward with a randomized control trial with that primary outcome measure because it's simply going to be a problem. People are not understanding what you mean, and it's going to lack validity. The randomized control trial was actually delayed while they analysed the data, and they moved forward with, they started the train again, and the train went forward in a slightly different direction, if you like. But so much of the time, the randomized control trial was never going to stop, and the attention paid to the qualitative research was minimal when the qualitative research was undertaken at the pre-trial stage. When it was undertaken alongside a randomized control trial, for example, to explain the findings, a paper might be published, or it might not, or a paper might be published without actually documenting what the trial finding was. And so the explanation, the explicit explanation for the trial finding, wasn't actually there within the publication. And what we found was that the way teams worked were very, very different, or the way the researchers, the interviewees described teams was very, very different. So some teams described the qualitative research being a bit of an add-on. I think we have read that in a sort of a number of papers from the US, for example, Sandalowski and the Song have written about this, and also in the UK. But there was also a model of working where the researchers were very interested in the qualitative research. Everybody working on the team, very, very interested in it, but not interested enough to necessarily take any action based on it. And not necessarily interested enough to make sure that the qualitative research had enough resources and enough time for analysis, for example. But there were also teams where the qualitative research was at the heart of the research in the way that the randomized controlled trial was at the heart of the research. So the team was as interested in the qualitative research as they were interested in the randomized controlled trial. And in these types of teams, which we called a sort of an integrated team, the team made sure that the resources were there for the qualitative research, and also resources were there in terms of listening to the qualitative research and thinking about what that meant for the whole endeavour of generating evidence of effectiveness. And so I think, first of all, we need to be thinking about studies, not thinking about randomized control trials. And often you hear about people talking about a randomized control trial, which includes some qualitative research. I think we have a study, we have an evaluation, and that evaluation includes a randomized control trial, includes qualitative research, often includes other quantitative methods such as analysis of routine data. and will include an economic evaluation. And I also think we need to start talking more about generating evidence of effectiveness, which is actually the context in which we do all this work. Because I think if we think of that as the goal, we might be writing up our papers in a different way. We might be undertaking our research in a different way. We might be valuing our qualitative research more. The work that I talked about today about value, we have written about in more detail in a book chapter that has been, the book was published by Charlotte Hess-Biber and Bert Johnson. And then Henny Boj from Europe listened to us talking about it and got together with us to write that up again in more detail and with a slightly different slant. But that's all I wanted to say today, and I wanted to thank you very much for listening to me. I'm very interested to hear about the questions that you have.
Hi, Alicia. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Patrick.
Hi, Alicia.
Yes, Patrick. Can you hear me?
Hi. Sorry, we're having some issues with technology here on this side. Yes, I can hear you now. So
okay,
we're going to have some time for questions and answers now. So if you bear with me here for a moment, I'm just going to take a question from people that we have in the room here with us. So does anybody want to offer a question for Alicia?
I do. This, do you want me to come over, Patrick, or are you going to?
Maybe just make sure we hear you, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm thinking is, what are the key elements that need to be in place to get towards these mixed methods evaluations? Because my concern is that someone applying for a bid is going to be fearful of the change of terms away from the trial. So what are the key things that need to be in place to move towards that?
Patrick, could you repeat the question so everybody could hear it?
We might just get Andrew to repeat.
Sorry, Lisa, it's Andrew here. Thank you again for that. That was great. I love the idea of May's normalizing towards, normalizing trials, and the idea of making a mixed methods evaluation of an intervention. Does that have, is that change of terms fearful for a trialist? And what do we need to do to persuade people who are going to undertake these interventions that the qualitative work needs to be there? Slightly complicated, I know.
Yeah, so in the book chapter that I referred to at the end of the talk, I did recommend that we start to use different language and start to call these studies mixed methods evaluations or mixed methods intervention studies, simply because that gets you away from the thought that you are only doing a trial with little bits and pieces around it. It moves away from overvaluing one part of the evaluation. Will trialists be fearful of me trying to change the language that we use? Well, of course they will, and I can perfectly understand that. But I do think that we need this shift, because I think these questions about context in particular are so important for the utility of the information that we are generating from these randomized controlled trials. We just have to rebalance the value we give to the research questions. And of course there will be resistance and concerns and fears, but I still will stand my ground and say that we need to do that. And I think the way to do it is to listen to the arguments for it, And if you're persuaded, start using that language. And over time, the language might change, because language does change over time. And the things that people value and how we do our research changes over time. We're constantly modifying our approaches to research and improving our approaches to research. And I love that. And I'm just saying, I'm just recommending a direction and a way forward.
Great, thanks, Alicia. So some questions from online. We have a question from Kate Locke, and this is, how does this tie in with implementation science and realist evaluation work?
Okay, so first of all, how does it tie in with implementation science? I think a lot of what I've been talking about today has been in the realms of implementation science, where you are thinking about how to implement research within the real-world context. So I think implementation science does make use of randomized controlled trials, but also makes use of quality improvement approaches, iterative approaches to improving quality. But I think that the world of implementation science and the researchers who work in that world can have a lot of strong messages, helpful advice for trialists, particularly those who are undertaking trials of complex interventions, but also trials of more simple interventions in complex environments.
Right.
In terms of the realist approach, I know that Bonnell and colleagues here in the UK have written about realist randomized controlled trials. And in a realist randomized controlled trial, they are interested in context, mechanism, and outcome. And when I put up the functions of a process evaluation, I've talked about context, mechanism, and implementation. So you can certainly see the overlap there. I know Chris Bonnell takes it a stage further in terms of thinking about not getting away from this single question of, is it effective, to effective for whom, in what circumstance. So I think, again, everything that I've said today is within the realms of that sort of realist approach.
Great, thanks, Alicia. So another question, a very interesting one. Do you ever find that qualitative research is an added burden for participants who may already be doing an RCT of an intervention, i.e. will participants feel it is too much and drop out?
I think it can be a concern that you don't want to overburden people. But where I see burden on patients is when I see a randomized controlled trial and they've got 22 outcome measures, and I'm thinking, goodness me, and somebody's got to complete that 4 times throughout the trial. I mean, there's a burden for you. The burden of a qualitative interview of an hour. Well, some people refuse to be interviewed, and that's fine. They say they're too busy. But actually, a lot of people that we approach say yes to interviews. And the feedback we get is that they really enjoy the interviews because they're giving their reflections on things. The agenda is almost totally theirs. And so I would say, if you're thinking about the burden on an individual patient, it's a very important thing to think about. Think about what the burden the trial data collection is placing on them. Don't be too concerned about the qualitative research, but of course, always think about it.
Great, thank you. So another question from Carol Bug, I think is how it's pronounced.
Is it B-U-G-G-E?
Yes. Yeah.
I've read something written by Dr. Bug.
Oh, okay, yeah. Great. So she's asking here, do you think with the MRC guidance that there is now more of a motivation for funders to fund the package of research as opposed to the trial alone and to fund the qual work well?
Yes, I do. I mean, the context of research funding is so different for different countries. And in the UK, we have a funding body called the National Institute of Health Research, and that has a number of funding groups within it. And one group is Health Technology Assessment, where they fund randomised controlled trials with qualitative research and economic evaluation. But I will say now, the randomised controlled trial is king there. When you get to another part of that funding body, the applied research programs, which are 5-year program grants, where they will fund the development work and the feasibility work around an intervention, and fund the randomised controlled trial, and fund process evaluation and economic evaluation. They put a lot of weight on all those different aspects of the development and evaluation of the complex intervention. And they want to see the Medical Research Council guidelines for the development and evaluation of complex interventions being used. And I think that their funding is generous towards all those different aspects. I don't know what it's like in different countries, but I think in the UK at the moment we are lucky. We also have the UK Medical Research Council, which has recently been funding intervention development, where you can look at modifying an intervention and looking at its feasibility before going to full randomised controlled trial. So I think that the funders are really on board with all of this in my country.
Okay, fantastic. So one more question. This is coming from Fabian Joly-Kerr. Would you please tell us more about the way you analyze the different results coming from qualitative and quantitative data?
Okay, can I just clarify what Fabian means? Qualitative, I've got the qualitative data. Do you mean the quantitative data from the randomised control trial, or do you mean the quantitative data from the process evaluation?
I don't have more information than that. I mean, that was the length of the question. I'd imagine that this was a question about mixed methods, perhaps?
Yeah, so let me just assume that the question was about having qualitative and quantitative research within a process evaluation. How then do you go about analysing that data? Well, the way that I would go about it, and I'm seeing my colleagues do this, and I'll just mention Dr. Danny Hind, who's here at the University of Sheffield, who is doing this currently. To analyse the qualitative data separately, to analyse the quantitative data separately, and then to bring those two sets of data together using a technique called triangulation protocol, which allows you to display the qualitative and quantitative data on the same page and to ask questions of it around whether the two sets of data are converging and agreeing and telling you the same thing, or the qualitative data is, for example, helping to explain or illuminate something that is happening in the quantitative data, that is, there's partial agreement or complementarity, or the two sets of data are disagreeing with each other and there is dissonance and contradiction, or you have information from one data set that is not there in the other data set, and you have to stop and think about whether you should have information in both the data sets. By taking that approach, it stops researchers focusing only on where there is convergence. Because of course, as human beings, well, as some human beings just love it when everything matches and everything's okay. Other human beings amongst us love a bit of contradiction and focus only on that. It helps you to take a methodical approach to look at all your data and how both the qualitative and quantitative work together. So there are people at the moment who are publishing triangulation protocol in this context. And I'm just going to try and get the name of someone who's done that. Her name is Tonkin Cryan. She works down in the University of Southampton, and she's published very recently on a triangulation protocol for a process evaluation alongside a cluster randomised controlled trial. I'm using lots of examples from the UK. I'm really sorry about that for our international audience. There's lots of wonderful work from Canada, America, and Europe as well. And I'm being very UK focused, and apologies.
I think that's okay. So one final question for you, Alicia. When you are at the end of an RCT, at what point do qualitative researchers see the outcome data for the subgroup participants who have been followed up? Do we have to wait until lockdown of quantitative data of all participants in the trial?
So the MRC guidance for process evaluation says that if you're using qualitative research to explain the result of the trial, you should analyze your data first before the trial outcome is known. And then when you know the trial outcome, you can consider how that helps to explain the trial result. This means that you are looking at issues around important subgroups before your trial data is known. And you can generate hypotheses about subgroup analyses that could be taken using the full randomized controlled trial data. Does that answer the question?
That's great, thank you. So Alicia, that's the last of our questions for today. So I just want to thank you for presenting and to thank everybody for attending. Our next webinar will be on November 21st at 4 p.m. This will be with Professor Sally Wick from the University of Glasgow, and she will be focusing on process evaluation in trials. So again, thanks to everybody today.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.